What is it you want, Barry? What do you want? You want the moon? Just say the word and I'll throw a lasso around it and pull it down.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, dying times here.
Come with me if you want to live.
That's it, man. Game over, man. Game over.
The Force will be with you, always.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to 20th Century Geek. I'm your regular host, Scott Weatherly, and today we're going to be talking Watchmen. Now, not just the original graphic novel, we're probably going to touch on that, but we're going to talk about everything around Watchmen, before Watchmen, and after Watchmen, Doomsday Clock, the HBO series. But I'm not going to do this on my own. I've brought my good friend Julian Darius along to talk about Watchmen as well. So, Julian, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, and it is a special pleasure to be back on 20th Century Geek.
Excellent. I'm glad to have you back. It's exciting times to have you back because obviously we've kicked off our other podcast, Stories Out of Time and Space, and we've got a couple of episodes out. So it's exciting times for us in the podcasting world.
Yeah, and I hope that listeners will listen to both and that there'll continue to be crossovers between the two.
Yes, there will indeed. So today we are going to be talking about Watchmen. And I think it's only really fair to talk about the original Alan Moore, Dave Gibbons graphic novel first, really. So we'll touch on that. So really, what's your sort of initial thoughts, or what are your thoughts on Watchmen from 1985, 86?
I think that it holds up pretty well. I think it's lost a little bit of its prestige in the ensuing sort of last decade and a half.
Mm-hmm.
But it is a touchstone for me. I think it's a touchstone for a lot of comics people. For a while, it was sort of the closest thing I had to a Bible, is in terms of something that I would just pick off the shelf, open to a random page, and just kind of read that sequence again and sort of put it down and think about it. So Watchmen has a sort of special place in my heart for that, as I think it does a lot of comics readers. But I do think that that place in my heart has kind of lessened a little. I do feel less emotionally attached to it. I've been aware of its devices and sort of taken it apart and looked at how it does what it does and its structure. And I think that its flaws have become more apparent in the last sort of decade and a half. Although I still think it's a titanic accomplishment and excellent, and I would recommend it to people and buy it for people. It's sort of that very familiar book at this point where I say, that's sort of in my DNA now, but I sort of take it for granted. What about you, Scott?
Yeah, I think very similar in many ways. It's that sort of book that if you're a comic book reader or of the nerd world, then you are you're very aware of it. It's a part of that, the Mount Rushmore of comics. It's on there. So yeah, I think it's hugely important. I think it's what established Alan Moore as the comic sort of titan that he is. I've read it, God knows how many times. I've read it quite a few times and gone back to it. And as you say, sort of one of those things you can just pull down and I can happily enjoy it to different degrees. Like, there have been times when I've read it cover to cover and all the sort of supplementary material between each of the chapters. But then there's also times, as you say, I can just go and enjoy a sequence, or I can just read the issues without the supplementary material. I still enjoy that as a sort of as a story. I think it's hugely successful as a story. Do I enjoy it as a technical piece? I think I still do. I think there's still, like you say, there's some things that I think Alan Moore, even to himself, would admit that things, if with his experience and view on politics now, he would probably do things differently. But
can you hear me, Scott?
No, I think it's still worth viewing. It's one of those interesting ones though that I know that people have come to me and
Yeah.
said, um, "Should I start with Watchmen? Should I go straight to it?" And I think it's one of those things. I'm like, no, 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 no. Please read, lighter stuff and some other things first. Get yourself into the universe, because if you don't get yourself into the universe first, then you've got little to no chance of understanding what the hell is going on or who these characters are sort of pastiches of. Um, so I still think it has an important place, really, and I do think it holds up, as you say. Um, but do you think then it's sort of, Julian? Do you still think it deserves that? Often it hits those lists as like the most important or the greatest graphic novel of all time. Do you still think it sort of sits in that place?
I don't know about the greatest graphic novel of all time. I think that it's constrained by its genre. It is, as you said, references past superhero works. You kind of need a little bit of understanding of superhero history to appreciate it. You don't necessarily have to know that it's a take on the Charlton heroes,
Mm.
but you do need a little bit of superhero literacy and comics literacy to appreciate it. Um, so I don't know that it's in the top spot anymore. I think it's in the top 10. I think it is sort of a little hard going for new readers. It's long, it's a little dense, it's a little cerebral. It's also a little silly, frankly, with the squid and with some other things. But it is great. I love it. I think it's still in the top 10, but I think it's been kind of dethroned or displaced just a little, and there isn't as much of a consensus about what would replace it as number one. Do you feel the same way?
Yeah, I almost think it's at number one by default now. It's almost like if you don't say that it's at number one, you're wrong. You're going to be decried as being wrong. But oddly, I think if you required if you're required to have special knowledge beforehand, I almost think that sort of it prevents it from being in that top place. Like, as I said, I couldn't give this to a newbie. I couldn't just hand this to someone and say, "Oh, you've never read a comic before, but actually, this is a good novel. It's a graphic novel for you to read." Um, and I actually think it should. There are barriers to entry to this. And I don't think that
Hmm.
should be the case for something that's the number one graphic novel of all time. We're probably going to get letters about that, but I,
Well,
I
I don't know about that. I mean, I think that at least in my circles, there are now a lot of people just who are anti Watchmen.
mm,
And I think there's been a lot more awareness of things that I kind of recognized, and I sort of spent really the 90s and early 2000s thinking, boy, somebody's going to write the essay on like how Watchmen is in fact an instance of somebody falling in love with her rapist. That is a trope that,
mm,
especially in the 90s, really was focused on in manga and other works as really a social problem. And Watchmen has it.
mm-hmm.
And nobody had really hit Watchmen for a while there. And I thought, yeah, this is going to happen. I don't know that I want to be the one to do it, but certainly the gender issues, the racial issues, it is a work of the 80s, and it is the work of undoubtedly very intelligent, progressive people, both in Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons, and presumably John Higgins too.
Mm.
I mean, these are intelligent, progressive minded people, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have problems. And I think that in my circles, for as many people as still defend it and would have no problem with it being in the top 10, there are somebody else who says, oh my God, why would you even put that in the top 10 anymore? Which I think is a little reactionary the other way, although, I'm a white dude, so, that's okay. I mean, there's room for different opinions.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. I mean, I think it definitely has. It's a time capsule as well, though, isn't it? Because it definitely represents politics of the time, and um, also sort of social considerations of the time. I mean, the whole thing of it's, even though it was written by a Brit in Alan Moore, it obviously addresses some of the feelings around losing or having lost in Vietnam. So, which is less of a consideration. I suppose you could sort of, place that over with sort of like recent wars in Afghanistan and the Middle East, but it does. It definitely feels a place a piece for its time. But I mean, in my opinion, I honestly think Alan Moore has written better works since. I talked about barriers to entry before, but I just think as a graphic novel and as a piece of art, as a complete story, I think over the last few years, I've begun to appreciate From Hell more than I think I appreciate Watchmen. But obviously
Totally fair.
But I think less people read it, and I think less people read it because it had a terrible, terrible film adaptation with Johnny Depp, which less spoken about the better, really. But I do. I think Alan Moore has written better things since that don't get the attention. I think it's because for some reason we went through, and maybe again it was things like we were going through the British invasion, but there was a change in comics at that time, and you just get a series of you get a series of books that seem to just sort of say, oh yeah, now this is grown up comics. You've got Watchmen and The Dark Knight Returns and all this other stuff, and people don't seem to have moved past that greatly.
Yeah, I agree. Although I think that in recent years, both of those works have been attacked, and they've been attacked in ways that I do understand, that I've already outlined about representation and social criticism, and even structural problems, even narrative problems within Watchmen, and Dark Knight, which all of which I think is very fair. But I also think we're in a time in which essentially the deconstructive mode of revisionism in the 80s is pilloried. So, I feel as if, sort of on the left, I know a lot of people who just think it's sexist and racist. I'm simplifying there, obviously. But, then there are sort of a fanboy contingent who, sort of say, oh, yeah, that's that dark stuff that, led to Batman v Superman. We like the Marvel movies. Give us Jeff Johns, give us, I want Green Lantern to be Hal Jordan and show me punching something. And I do not care how smart it is, how realistic it is. Realism is stupid. And I really feel as if there's a sort of reactionary contingent. I wouldn't say on the right, but sort of, in the fanboy realm of things that really mocks the idea of trying to take superheroes seriously, or making them realistic, or even caring about a consistent timeline, and is just very anti all of the values of the 80s superhero revolution and that British invasion in a way that I find very shocking.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, one of the things, we're going to talk about the fact that this book now has two official sequels, one in the HBO series and one in the sort of in Doomsday Clock. But the fact of the sort of the point, well, at least one of the points that Alan Moore tried to make several times, really, originally with Miracle Man and then obviously with Watchmen as well, is things have an inevitability of sort of with these, you introduce superpowers or you introduce the idea of costume superheroes, they are gonna have an eventual conclusion. Like there's no event, So this idea of churning out, and I'm just as guilty of enjoying these as everybody other comic nerd, but this idea of churning out adventure after adventure and having to change the canon, and that obviously comes up in Doomsday Clock, and we'll get to that. Spoilers, by the way, we're going to spoil the crap out of both Doomsday Clock and HBO's Watchmen. But like you say, so that comes up. But the point really of Watchmen, especially with sort of Dr. Manhattan and and also sort of the conclusion for Silk Spectre and Night Owl, sort of those characters, is things end. They sort of, there's a suggestion that the world carries on, but these characters end. Like Dr. Manhattan gets to a point where he's like, yeah, I've actually got almost omnipotent powers. Like I can create life, and being on Earth doesn't really make much more sense to me anymore. So I'm going to go explore the cosmos. All right, well, that's actually like almost like an inevitability of, I've lost that humanity that's keeping me here. Like I've got no interest in social interaction or humanity. I've actually got bigger things to think about and to consider. So I'm going to go. Okay, well, that's almost like the Superman question, isn't it? Sort of like, what makes him care about humans? Like if you don't have, and it's sort of, I know it's sort of addressed in Doomsday Clock. If you don't have Ma and Pa Kent keeping you grounded, then yeah, you're gonna just want to go off and do things all over the place. And the same for, and the same for sort of Silk Spectre and Night Owl, as they sort of settle down. And they're like, yeah, I'm hanging it up. We're older, my knees can't take this much longer. And we seem to have come to a level of happiness where we can deal with life. So that's what we're going to do. I'm not going to be angst-ridden and troubled by this whole thing of having to save my city for the next however many hundreds of years, and put children in harm's way. It just sort of, the idea of Watchmen was to say to people, was to take the idea that he'd introduced in Miracle Man and present it to that through the DC publishing of like, look, some of these books have got a full stop. And that's what they should do. But you won't let them.
Yeah, or it doesn't have to be a full stop. I mean, obviously, there's that whole line, nothing ever ends at the end of Watchmen, which, the HBO series makes a big deal of. And, so I don't think that it has to be a full stop. But yeah, there's going to be progression. It's not going to have this magical return to the status quo that we associate with sort of superhero episodic adventure. And one thing that you said, I just want to really touch on, which is the sense of inevitability, right? Some of what you're talking about is just that characters have a narrative arc, that they change and grow, and they don't just change because they made their costume darker, Batman, but they, actually change, and at some point this is not cool anymore. Their life is going to change. What you talked about, Night Owl and Silk Spectre, the point is that, like Rorschach is crazy. Batman is crazy. To go out and beat people up because you're angry at the world. I mean, you are not a well-grounded individual. Night Owl and Silk Spectre weren't as violent as that. They weren't as fractured and damaged as that, but they still got high off of being the hero and dressing up, being allowed to dress up and go out and have these adventures. And they admit over the course of Watchmen that part of this was sexual. And so there is a sense of, what I really love is the sense of inevitability, right? That I find that a lot of the narratives that I like the most are narratives that feel inevitable. And you know how you sort of watch a movie or you read a comic and it's like you get a twist and it's like, all right, Luke, I am your father, right?
Yeah.
But you get a twist like, haha, so-and-so was really somebody else all along. Or, you just get these, sort of shocking twists, TM, where you think, oh, this was not true all along. This might be fun. It might not. But certainly it's not inevitable given these characters in this situation. And I find that the stuff that I like the most has that sense of inevitability that Watchmen and Miracle Man have.
Yeah, I think that's sort of where because I mean the point of Watchmen, especially the ending of Watchmen, the showdown they have in Karnak, is they get there and they confront Ozymandias, and he's sort of like, oh yeah, I did it 30 minutes ago, it's done. Like there is no sort of grand finale, there's no defeating the villain, and even the villain in it, is that thing of going like, look, I'm doing this, it's a crazy idea, but it does what it's supposed to do. It prevents, we were literally on the the doomsday clock. We were 1 minute to midnight. We were about to have nuclear annihilation. I stopped that. I stopped the world from destroying itself. Yes, it cost us 3 million lives and this sort of thing, but I saved 7 billion.
Right.
And that's sort of, so the character sort of reaction to that is that, again, that inevitability where sort of like, Night Owl is broken by it, but is like, yeah, I sort of have to accept that I'm a man and I can't really do much about this.
Right. It's already done.
I can't prevent nothing. I can invent as can prevent this. Like nothing I can do can stop it. So I've now got to live in the world. And actually, is he right? Is Adrian Veidt right? Has he made the right decision? And it's the crazy one. It's Rorschach who is saying like no compromise. No, truth must be out. Everyone must know. And it's that thing, isn't it? Like, you actually the person that is less broken is the one that's saying, well, okay, well we've he has a point, and we've got to live with that. This, right. And so so the result is Dr. Manhattan has to kill Rorschach in order to prevent the escalation of nuclear war. Again, just one more casualty to prevent total annihilation. Is he right? And I know this is the debate that goes on, but like, is he right? Is he wrong? The fact of the matter is, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. It's happened. It's that inevitable. It happened. Now you've got to deal with it. And that's what
I think it's clear in Watchmen that he's right. I don't know whether Alan Moore agrees with that. Of course, it doesn't matter, what the author's intent was. But I mean, the reason I say that is because Adrian is clearly intended to be correct about his perception that nuclear war will in fact break out, that the doomsday clock represents this, and we are a minute to midnight. Nuclear war is going to happen. I think incidentally that this is probably more even than the politics of sort of the post Thatcher period and Reagan in the US that dates Watchmen, because I remember doing Duck and Cover in the 80s, and I was sort of part of the last generation that absolutely believed my life was going to end in nuclear fire. That was just me and all my friends. We knew we were going to die, and most likely we were not going to see 20. Because Reagan was busy saying dumb shit like, you can launch nukes from subs, and if you want to, you could just call them back. People were protesting outside the White House. You can't call them back. So it was a really scary time. But within the world of Watchmen, I think that narrative only works, and it really wants you to believe that, yes, in fact, Veidt has sort of like in the Foundation trilogy, he's sort of figured out this way of charting cultural energy and where a culture is going, and all the trend lines are pointing to nuclear war. And if there wasn't some kind of pressure valve to release that and unite people, that would have happened. And so if you accept that, which I think I don't really believe, I think that's one of the parts of Watchmen that doesn't necessarily make sense. But I think it wants you to accept that. And if you do accept that, then you're left with a kind of horrible calculation in which, 3 million people, go ahead.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's not a nice calculation, but I mean, you know, one of the, but is it? You know, it's that thing. It's a risk he takes. But I mean, one of the things that I see, you know, actually, it actually comes up in the sequels. Really, is this idea that, well, actually, in Watchmen, it's identified that Doctor Manhattan has the ability to, you know, deconstruct and reconstruct matter. Um,
Hmm.
so and he can teleport anyway. So why is he not used then to um, literally travel the world and dismantle all these nuclear weapons? Um,
Right.
you know, he could de-escalate that in an instant. But it's a short. That's the thing, is that becomes a short-term answer, isn't it? That's just him taking away someone's toys but they'll just rebuild them, and they'll, you know, you need to sort of give them something. I sort of see, you can sort of see what Veight's argument is. Like, you've got to give them that joint bigger bad for them to be scared of, to join together, um, and it's a risk and it's a calculation, and you know, I love the idea behind it, and I don't think I would be the person to make that decision, but it's how
I
it's sort
would.
of handled. Do you think you could? Do you think you could?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would feel pain thinking about those deaths. I think that's incumbent upon us in ethical decisions. But um, I've always identified with Veidt. Um, I think Veidt is the character I like the most, and that certainly that carries over into the HBO show. But
Mm.
you know, I find the depiction of Doctor Manhattan fascinating. I love all the Doctor Manhattan stuff. I think the depiction of Veidt is kind of like giving away his money and then making it all back is really, you know, unrealistic. You know, it plays on the idea of the sort of self-made man that we rise or fall in society to the levels that we deserve, which is fundamentally absurd and regressive. And I don't think Alan Moore was maybe in control of that element.
Mm.
Um, but no, I mean, I am comfortable with those kinds of decisions. Um,
But I think
and I
really,
don't think
so
many people are.
no, no. I mean, I think, you know, one of the things I always think back to, and when I read Watchmen, I go back to it's another comic, is in the um, in the early '80s, or around the same time actually. There was a Judge Dredd story called The Apocalypse War, which, you know, again was a conflict between the American megacities and the Soviet bloc, as it was, or as it would have been in the Judge Dredd universe. And part of Megacity is obliterated by nuclear weapons. And the part of the story ends when a group led by Judge Dredd breaks into the Soviet stronghold in future Russia and
Hmm.
obliterates the Soviet bloc by pressing the button and basically just killing everybody in and refiring the nuclear weapons back at the Soviet megacity and killing everyone, or was killing a huge amount of them. Um, and it's almost like it's the opposite of Veidt. This whole notion of, you know, we know Dredd is an anti-hero, he's a fascist, and he's willing to sort of retaliate to the ultimate. This is the hero of the comic, is willing to press the button to kill billions of people, or at least tens of
Hmm.
millions of people, and step away the hero. Yet the villain of Watchmen is the one that's killed less people but saved more. Um,
Right.
and you know, that's always been a bit of a. I've always considered those two things, those two moments of like, well, Dredd's, you know, I know he's meant to be satirical and stuff, but he's still held up as the hero, and people still see him as sort of a heroic character. Yet it's in canon, it's still there. Like, it's come back to haunt him like multiple times. He killed tens of millions of people, but there was no saving the rest of the world. It was an act of retaliation. That's it. Um, you
Well,
know, and that
it presumably saved the rest of Megacity 1, right?
yeah,
I
but
mean, right. There
it
were
was
nukes that.
already made its way through. Yeah, so, you know,
Right.
parts of Mega City One had already been obliterated. Um, but it's held up as that heroic wartime act. Yet Veidt is obviously sort of like, as you say, sort of like in the book, is held up as almost like the villain. It's that sort of the Bond villain
Yeah.
thing at the end.
But that's fantastic. You make an excellent point, and I think everything depends on the way things are framed. And this is something that increasingly frustrates or annoys me. That, like, that's not supposed to be. It's been a while since I read the Apocalypse War, but that's not supposed to be a heroic act within the narrative. But because Judge Dredd is in the position of the protagonist, we are inclined to forgive him because we have been trained to forgive the protagonist basically any default. So, I mean, you can have somebody, literally murder in cold blood, or, do something, this unforgivable. And certainly if anything's unforgivable, it's that. And as long as they're the star of the next story, we're sort of conditioned to say, oh yeah, I identify with them. Even if I don't know that they're a good guy, I want them to win. Whereas I think Watchmen is, frames Ozymandias as the bad guy. And structurally within the story, he's the bad guy. He's the antagonist. And you are invited to question this in a way that I think is impossible in a continuing narrative.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point, because again, sort of that idea of, it's almost like what Watchmen is set up to be a mystery. It's initially it starts out as a murder mystery, doesn't it? That's the idea. Who killed the comedian? And so the first person that you see as a protagonist that's actively going to investigate this crime is Rorschach. And so I think that's why so many people seem to instinctively say, like, oh yeah, Rorschach's my favorite character, or Rorschach is the main character. When even Alan Moore himself has actually said, like, whenever I meet people that tell me that Rorschach is their favorite character, like, I disengage from that conversation as quickly as possible. Because he's not. That's the point. Like the point that Alan Moore is making, and he sort of tricks you into it that, oh yeah, he's the first character you're going to meet. We're going to make him relatively sympathetic when you sort of learn of his past. But he is morally broken and psychologically damaged. Like, this character is sort of, he is not a good person. He's not in a good place. Like, he needs help, and him patrolling the streets doesn't keep anybody safe. Because if he's, you could be littering and he could take that as, a crime and just give you an absolute kicking for it, like that, and he would see that as fine. And so I find it really interesting that sort of like, Rorschach is, he has an impact on the world and obviously on the sequels as well. But that hero narrative and the setup of the protagonist, I like the fact it's there to trick you. Even with Night Owl, really, is questionable in his. He said, like, as you say, like, he gets back into it because he's sort of like, yeah, my life, I'm going through a bit of a midlife crisis. I could buy a sports car, or I could put the costume back on. It's
and
sort
Shag's
of like
Silk Spectre.
Yeah, exactly. So it's he's not doing it for what you could say was sort of morally clear reasons. He's doing it because he's got a slump in his life, and this is something he loved doing. So, or at least he enjoyed it. It's picking up a hobby, and just so happens that hobby involved, crime fighting, or fighting at least.
Well, I mean, that's one thing that I love about Watchmen, is that it exists within a far more realistic moral universe than the average superhero story. And one of the problems with the superhero narrative is nobody has ever gotten superpowers and thought, you know what I should do with this? Let's stop some bank robbers. Absolutely not. At least, like, the time that I like Spider-Man most is when he's like, oh, I'm 14 or whatever, I have superpowers, I'm gonna be a wrestler and make a lot of money. Like, that's awesome. I just want, let the story continue there. I don't, let him learn something 3 years from that story. I don't need him to learn it 10 pages later, because that's what I like. I just don't find it interesting or believable that somebody says, I'm going to stop bank robbers, or even less believable, I'm going to stop the guy who's dressed like a scorpion and, you know, and has a stinger tail. Okay. But to the point about Rorschach, no, I mean, I utterly sympathize with Alan Moore there. And we've talked about this a little, but I sometimes despair that like Rorschach has more in common with the Batman of the Dark Knight, right? I mean, just a violent, terrible person in a lot of ways. And I sometimes despair that no matter what characters we put out into the culture, even when the writers are sort of teaching us not to identify with them or make it crystal clear, like Rorschach is messed up, give it a few years and people will always take the authoritarian approach. And I just think that at least all of us to different degrees, let me be generous, are wired toward authoritarianism. And this is why, you know, when we talked on Stories Out of Time and Space about Starship Troopers, give it time and people will be like, that's great, you know. Rambo, if your response to Rambo is like, he's badass, that's awesome, I identify with him, rah rah war, you didn't watch that movie, and yet that is exactly what everybody takes from it, or at least certainly a majority. And I think that while Rorschach is presented as human, it's sort of Shakespeare doing the thing of granting the villain interior space and making them a full-fledged character, at least in a few scenes. Rorschach, definitely, you can sympathize with him. He's interesting, you know, but yeah, if you identify with him and come away saying, yeah, Rambo's the good guy, you've got a problem.
Yeah. I think that's sort of that's the sort of the reason I wanted to sort of touch base and talk about Watchmen in this way first was because I think obviously we've now going to talk about the we talk on to the sequels, and you know that piece of work, Watchmen as a piece of work, as we've said, is a capsule of the time. It contains that sort of politics, its social norms, but it's also making a comment on the superhero narrative, and that superhero narrative is that there's things progress, and I think rather than saying there's a full stop, there's progression, and things have to change. And I think really both of these sequels, or both the creators of the sequels, I would say, have read that book differently, or at least in a different place, and. Well, firstly, I mean, I'm trying to have to say it.
I mean, perhaps even before that, we could point out that, like, I mean, I'm sure you remember the shock of when Snyder was directing the adaptation. Because, we had grown up with Watchmen. Watchmen was this kind of sacred text that was seen to be unfilmable. And, we had the aborted attempt in the sort of late 80s, early 90s with Terry Gilliam, and we just thought this was never going to happen. And then it happened, and it was the most loving, faithful adaptation of Watchmen that you could possibly imagine. I mean, they changed the squid ending. There's a brilliant title sequence that has some stuff that wasn't there, but just got the tone so dead wrong. Alan Moore has and Dave Gibbons have Watchmen, have Rorschach going up the side of a building to investigate the comedian's murder. And while that's a little unrealistic, they wanted these to be characters who suffered and, struggled and were out of shape. And then Snyder has them punching through walls and flipping around, doing jump kicks, during the raid on the prison. And it just feels like, I think that's still a good movie. I would defend that film, but there was something missed as far as the tone. And I think that the reason I mention this is because I think both when you look at Doomsday Clock and you look at HBO's Watchmen, they get certain things from the original. They take it in different directions, but they both miss things in the original or choose to ignore them. in the same way that Snyder chose to ignore sort of that realistic tone.
I think, yeah, I mean, to talk about the Snyder version, and obviously there's multiple versions of that film. There are things I like about it. It's a perfectly watchable film, as in it. I mean, it looks beautiful. I mean, whatever my feelings are about Snyder as a director, I think he is a wonderful photographer. Like, he has got a really good eye of how to film some things. I do agree that I think some of the casting is spot on, and I think Jackie Earle Haley is fantastic, and he clearly, I think he clearly gets that Rorschach is not a nice person. Like, he understands that character is broken, and sort of goes a long way to portraying him in that way. And I think he's really good in the role. But again, we get back to that sort of the Silk Spectre and Night Owl, and the fact is, like, throughout it, like you say, they sort of allude to the fact that that Night Owl is, he's middle aged. He sort of suggests he's a little bit out of shape. He hasn't really been keeping up his exercise or whatever. But then the moment he puts on the flaming Night Owl costume, and they start rescuing people, like I say, when he goes into the prison to rescue Rorschach, like, yeah, no, you're basically watching sort of Batman v Superman. Like, you're watching that level of sort of like they're snapping legs and sort of like say flipping over people, and I'm just like, and yeah, it is. It's I'm like, oh no, you sort of like take him, you give him with one hand and take him with the other. It's sort of like, at least sort of like commit to it. But yeah, and so we have had that, and I think, like you say, it's I have got issues with that film, and it's one of those. Well, I mean, I can leave it or take it or leave it, I think.
Right. I mean, I might like it more than you do. I was maybe devastated after I saw it, in the sense that, it wasn't my Watchmen and I didn't know how to feel about it. And Watchmen means something to me. But I mean, the other reason why I bring it up and think it's important to address is because my brother basically hasn't read a comic book in 25 years, maybe 20 years. And he loves Watchmen, the Snyder film. And I don't think he ever read the graphic novel, even though I had it. I mean, I guess he just didn't want to read it. And he basically gave up comics when he was 14 or so and never looked back. But when he watches that Snyder movie, he says, look, it's indisputably the best superhero movie ever made. At least superhero movie with powers. I actually agree with that, for all of its flaws. And, so for somebody who did not grow up with Watchmen as a sacred text the way we did, that movie was able to show them a lot of what we admired about Watchmen. Dr. Manhattan on Mars, Dr. Manhattan in Vietnam, that they are old and out of shape, that it's not just glorious, that Rorschach is messed up. All of that stuff resonates with a smart moviegoer who doesn't know comics in a way that you and I can't identify with. And I think that, especially talking about HBO's Watchmen, that definitely that same dynamic applies.
No, I agree, and I think it's difficult to translate comics, especially something as large as Watchmen, to the screen. And Snyder captured as much as he could, and then did it all in slow mo. But there are certain moments in the book that I think are really important that I just don't. I think sort of one of the points that I always took away from the book is, although you've got these costumed adventurers and you've got someone with superpowers and everything else going on and trying to solve this mystery, and eventually sort of coming to the point of, conclusion and actually understanding what the mystery is, and obviously, the whole thing with the squid or whatever, that's all fine. I mean, it's almost like the Indiana Jones effect from Raiders of the Lost Ark. Like, even if they didn't do anything, even if like Rorschach didn't investigate and Night Owl didn't get involved, like the event at the end would still happen. It would still be exactly the same. They don't really impact on a great deal, but the story's good. Like, you get to have the mystery unpacked. So the thing that I sometimes take away from Watchmen I enjoy more is there's little moments like, the kid and the little boy is reading the pirate comic and the guy at the newsstand.
New York.
Yeah, and then the sort of the relationship between Rorschach's psychiatrist and his wife,
Yeah.
and how that sort of
Yeah.
relationship disintegrates. And you basically get this sort of, eventually, towards the end, you've got these several relationships that are all coalescing in sort of that one place when the event, the New York event happens. Because the whole point is like, yeah, these superpowers can't seem to come to a conclusion. They're not going to come to an agreement, so they're about to bomb the crap out of each other. So this is the conclusion I've come to, is I'm going to have to introduce this bigger bad for them to worry about. But at ground zero, you're seeing all these people that actually, like, I've come to like and sort of learn a bit about, like, more sort of slips them in. It's like, you've got this, and then you learn a bit more and more. So when you're actually seeing them at the end, like, it gives Weitz, although you've said about, yes, he's made the right decision, and you sort of, he is portrayed as being right, but you are being shown the impact of that decision because you've been given snippets of those characters. So it has an impact, it has weight, it has an emotional resonance. The problem, I think, is with Snyder is he likes the big bang and the slow-mo fighting.
Yeah.
But he misses that sort of thing. So when they eventually have the thing at the end, and granted, I do like the change. I think the change, made sense for the big screen to make it so that he could blame Dr. Manhattan. I like that. I think it's a good idea. But you just see it. You see the end and you go, oh yeah, that's terrible. But it's no more terrible than seeing. It's supposed to be the big impact at the end of the film, but it's no different to seeing a city being destroyed in Independence Day or Transformers or some other superhero film. Like, it didn't have that emotional impact that Alan Moore gives it, and I think that's one of the things I sort of, if he held back in other areas, he could have slipped that in a bit more and been a bit more conscious of that, of what he was aiming at.
What's strange is, like, it's such a faithful adaptation. I mean, Snyder had to fight for so many shots in that film. There are shots of, the auto repair shop, that's a, obsolete models of specialty. They recreated that sign. That was not cheap to do. And it's for one shot, just to frame that shot like it is in the comic. At the same time, you can understand why they would cut this stuff. It's exactly the kind of stuff that in a 2-hour movie or 3-hour movie winds up on the cutting room floor. But I agree with you, and I think especially the psychiatrist sequence. I mean, I remember watching it for the first time in theaters and thinking, like, okay, well, we're 25 minutes in or so, and that's the end of Watchmen #1. And, because I have in my head, I know exactly where each issue ends. So it's like, okay, now we're X many minutes. And it's like, all right, now we're at the end of, Watchmen #2. We've had the whole funeral with the flashbacks. And I'm thinking, like, okay, we're like 45 minutes into this movie. There's going to be a lot of compression. And we get to that psychiatric sequence, which is really important to me. I happen to be an atheist. And, the loss of faith, whatever your religious beliefs are, the loss of faith as one encounters violence, and in the case of Rorschach, it was violence. In the case of the psychiatrist, it's Rorschach. Is important to me. It's also important to understanding cops and people who do deal with this kind of violence. And I remember all of that was like, it's like, okay, we're starting that chapter, and then that's like 6 minutes total. And in 6 minutes, he's like, I have seen the darkness. And I'm like, what? You just started seeing the darkness 5 minutes ago, So there are things like that hurt me as well.
But yeah, so it is as a movie and everything. I think it's a fun experience, but it's one of those that should never have been a movie. Like, I think one of the things I'll take from the HBO series is that Watchmen, as the original graphic novel, it should never have been a film. Like, it should have been like a 12-hour, 12 episode maxi series or premiere series on HBO or something like that. That's what I think. That's what it could have been. But
I agree 100%. So you want to do Doomsday Clock or HBO first? Let's do Doomsday Clock.
Let's do Doomsday Clock first. It's February 5th. I'm posting the next episode. Julian and I have been discussing Doomsday Clock and the HBO series. Many people are listening in and enjoying our discussion. It's a fantastic episode. I wonder if you're there. Well, ladies and gentlemen, there you have it, another great 20th Century Geek episode. Thank you for listening. If you would like to get in contact to suggest topics for future shows, or just chat about everything nerdy, you can email me at 20thcenturygeek@gmail.com. That's 20thcenturygeek@gmail.com. Or find me on social media, Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. Just search for 20th Century Geek. If you would like to support the show, please go on your podcast catcher and leave a 5-star review. I would greatly appreciate it. It raises the show in the ranks and lets more people know about the podcast. If you want to show more support for the podcast, we do have an Amazon wish list. Just go on Amazon and search for 20th Century Geek, and you will find a list of books that will help with research for future podcasts. And don't forget, we love second-hand books in 20th Century Towers. Once again, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.